Hi everyone, chess lovers. Welcome back to Chessway. In today's video, we're going to look at a truly fascinating game played between Mikhail Tal and McGunnar Johanson. This game took place in May 1966. All right, let's begin. The game starts with pawn to e4. Black replies with d5, the Scandinavian defense. Of course, the pawn is captured and the queen takes back. Then the knight comes out to c3, attacking the queen, and as usual, the queen slides back to a5. Tal continues with pawn to d4, and black responds with e6. After the white develops the knight to f3, Tal is suddenly the one being attacked first. Black brings out the bishop to b4, pinning the knight twice, but Tal ignores it, calmly developing his bishop to d3. Johanson doesn't take the knight yet, he plays knight to f6 instead. Still, Tal doesn't care. He castles short. So far, everything looks pretty standard. But let me ask you this. If you were black here, would you castle or take the knight? Because the knight is no longer pinned to the king. Well, that's your choice. But Johanson decides to take the knight. After the pawn recaptures, the queen also takes the pawn. Now black is up by one pawn and even attacks the rook. It looks good, right? But after the rook slides to b1, white gets great compensation. The king is safe, and all the pieces are ready to attack. The game continues with pawn to b6, preparing for bishop to b7, right? But that move is a bit too slow. It lets white freely develop. White plays rook to b3, attacking the queen. Now black must be very careful because the king is still in the center. For example, if the queen goes to c6, bishop to b5 would be a strong punishment. So there are only two safe choices, and the most logical is queen to a5. Time for Tal to start his slow attack. Knight jumps to e5. This is dangerous. If the queen takes the pawn, Tal's queen can head to f3, where the c6 square is already weak. Even if bishop to b7 is played, white can still go bishop to b5 with check, and if the pawn blocks, queen to f3 comes anyway. Very dangerous. All of this happens because the king is still stuck in the center, right? So black finally castles short. Looks safe now, since the knight also guards the h7 pawn. But remember, this is Mikhail Tal. He doesn't care. He sacrifices the bishop, taking the h7 pawn with check. An incredibly brave sacrifice. Of course, black has no better move than taking the bishop with the knight. Tal is fearless because he's already prepared rook to g3. What's the idea? It could be many things, but most likely bishop to h6 or queen to g4, both threatening checkmate. So black pushes the pawn to g6, trying to stop it. Now careful here. If the knight takes the pawn, that's a blunder, because the queen isn't ready yet. So there are two main options, queen to d3 or straight to h5. If it were me, I'd go for the safe move, queen to d3. But you know, Tal, he always chooses the risky path. He goes queen to h5. After black plays knight to d7, attacking the knight, this is where Tal's move makes sense. By placing the queen on h5, black can't sacrifice the knight for the pawn anymore since the queen is on the same diagonal. But I know what you're thinking. What if the rook takes the pawn instead? All right, let's analyze that. If the rook takes with check, then the pawn captures the rook, the queen takes back with check, the king is forced to h8, and bishop comes to h6, threatening checkmate. Looks amazing for white, right? If the rook tries to block on g8, knight jumps to f7, checkmate. However, remember, white has already lost a rook and a knight. So, black might try to trade queens to defend g7. After the pawn captures the queen, the rook slides to g8. Even then, I'd still say white is better. The black king is totally exposed, and white's attack continues. If it were me, I'd already be satisfied with this result. But do you think Mikhail Tal would stop here? Of course not. Let's get back to the actual game. In this position, the knight is clearly a strong piece, but Tal calmly plays queen to h6, offering to trade it. Johanson takes the knight without hesitation, but Tal has already shifted his target. Instead of recapturing, he plays rook to h3. Just like that, the attack switches sides instantly. Now, black is under direct threat of checkmate, but there are still two defensive tries, rook to d8 or knight to f3 with check. Moves like that are often seen in online games, and sometimes they look like engine moves, right? But this is a good moment to explain for beginners. If black plays knight to f3 with check, it's playable, but players rated 1200 to 1500 often don't understand the purpose. The idea behind this knight check is to keep the d-file closed, so white's rook can't join the attack easily. Players rated above 2000 probably visualize this instantly, but for beginners, let me show you why it matters. Earlier, I mentioned that black has two ways to defend, one of them being rook to d8. After that, queen takes the knight with check, the king is forced to f8, then queen to h8 check, king runs to e7, bishop g5 check. If the pawn blocks, that opens another attacking file for the rook. So the only realistic move is king to d6, trying to hide behind the queen. Now in this position, the king is on the d-file and white has the option to capture the rook with check. That's why the earlier knight sacrifice to f3 makes sense, because it prevents the d-file from being opened and attacked by the rook. Alright, back to the actual game. Instead of knight to f3 or rook to d8, black plays rook to e8, a terrible blunder. Let's see why. After queen takes the knight with check, the king moves to f8, and now comes the move that black overlooked, not queen to h8 check, but bishop to g5 first. The threat is direct and deadly, checkmate, and there's no real defense. If the pawn moves, then bishop to h6 is checkmate. That's why rook to e8 was a blunder. Johanson keeps playing though. He tries knight to f3 with check, but it doesn't help at all because the rook captures it. The checkmate threat remains. Black tries to take the bishop, but it ends beautifully with rook takes pawn, checkmate. What an incredible game. Here we can really see the difference in Tal's attacking vision. Most of us would already be satisfied with a clear advantage, but Tal keeps pushing, creating complications until his opponent finally blunders. That's the essence of Tal's brilliance. Relentless, creative, and fearless.
And alright, that's it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something from this wild and entertaining game. If I made any mistakes, please forgive me. Thanks for watching, chess lovers, and see you in the next video.